Now let's look at some examples of some of these stops and see some of the cognates in Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and English. We'll start with p, the voiceless labial stop. In this first example, a reconstructed form that means father, we have cognates of Latin pater, Greek pater, this line represents a long vowel, Sanskrit piter, and English father. Likewise, in this reconstructed form for foot, we have Latin pes and a corresponding form pedis, which means of the foot, Greek pous and a corresponding foot podos, which also means of the foot, Sanskrit pada, and English foot. So as we can see from this, the Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit all match what we reconstruct for Proto Indo European. A Proto Indo European p stays as p in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. In English, it undergoes Grimm's law from p to f. Next, let's talk a bit about b. Remember that I said that this was different from the other 5 basic stop sounds that we have in both English and Proto Indo European. And that's because there are no words in Proto Indo European for which we can definitely reconstruct a b. One of our best possible examples is here in this verb that means drink. The Latin word bibit corresponds to the Greek word pine and the Sanskrit word pibati. Now, the Latin form has 2 b's, and the Sanskrit one has 1, which looks promising, but the Greek has none, and this first letter in the Sanskrit is a p sound, not a b. So that means that it's hard for us to use this as an example of a b because we can't explain why there's a b in some places and a p in others. Additionally, Latin looks like it's our best example, or our best evidence. But Faliscan is a language that is really closely related to Latin, much more closely related than Latin is to Greek, Sanskrit, or English. But in Faliscan, we have the word pipatho, which means I will drink, with 2 p's and no b's. So this makes us even less certain and gives credence to the idea that Latin has taken a p and made it a b. So we can't say for sure that there are any such forms, and so we can't really talk about how it turns out in English. Next, let's look at the dental voiceless stop, t. This root means thin or stretched, and it comes out in Latin as tenuis, Greek tanaos, and Sanskrit tanuka, which corresponds to the English word thin. Again, a t comes out as t in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, while undergoing Grimm's law in English, th. So if Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit all agree on a sound, since they're 3 of the 4 oldest Indo-European branches, we generally believe that Proto-Indo-European has the same sound. It's really hard to argue that Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit all independently made changes that are different from Proto-Indo-European. English, which is much older, is easier to justify. Now let's look at the voiced version, d. In this root, which means tooth, we get Latin danes, Greek odus, and Sanskrit dan or dant, corresponding to English tooth. The d again stays the same in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and undergoes Grimm's law to t in English. Next, we'll look at k, and here we have a root that means take or hold or grasp. So this comes out in Latin as capio, in Greek as kope, and Sanskrit kapala, corresponding to English have. Now, this is not quite a perfect correspondence. Capio means take And if you take something, you have it. So, okay, copio and have could be related. Cope, a handle, something that you grab onto, that you hold. And kapala, a bowl, something that holds water or food, are a little less closely related in meaning. But all of these words have some general basic idea of grabbing or holding in common. So if these all seem, in terms of phonology, to come from the same source, and they all have a similar related meaning, then it seems reasonable to say that they all do, in fact, come from the same root. And although Latin spells the k sound with a c instead of a k, the Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit again show a k sound staying as a k, while English undergoes Grimm's law. K becomes h. We can look at another example of this. Latin cruor, which means blood or gore, corresponds to Greek kreos, meat or flesh, and Sanskrit krawi, which all correspond to English raw. This is an older form, and this is what we get if we apply Grimm's law. The k becomes a h. But English doesn't stick with these combinations of consonants at the start of words. We don't have any words in English that start with hr. English chooses to simplify this to make it easier to pronounce by getting rid of that h sound, leaving only raw. There's no trace in modern English of this k. This is really common in Grimm's law, especially with k. But again, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit all have the k sound, and in English we at least reconstruct that Grimm's law goes through. Finally, let's look at the voiced version of this, g. This root means grow, generally. We have Latin augeo, Greek auxano, which does not mean handle, but does mean grow. Sanskrit ojas, or something like that. And English eke, or eek in modern English. So here, our G is at the end, but we end up with a G in Latin. We'll come back to this Greek in a moment. This looks a little bit different. This Sanskrit, though, is not a G, that's a J. And this English comes out as Grimm's law says it should, to a G. Now, this Greek form, auxano, this X, what's written as an X, is a ks sound. Two different consonants put together, a k and a s. So it's really hard to say a g and a s together. We can't really say gz. So what's written as an X is actually g plus s put together and made easier to pronounce. That's okay, even though it looks kind of weird. But we can see from the Sanskrit that we have some problems. This g doesn't always correspond to a g in Sanskrit.